The blood on Thomas Fletcher's hands had long since dried, but he could still see it every time he closed his eyes, could still feel the weight of his wife's cooling body. As he carried her to the grave, he dug himself beneath the cottonwood tree behind their cabin in Nevada, Missouri. 6 months had passed since the fever took Margaret in the bitter cold of last winter, and now the summer heat pressed down on him like a physical burden as he guided his wagon down the rutted main street, the lumber in the back rattling with each bump and jostle. He had taken to working himself near to death, spending sunrise to sunset repairing fences and barns for anyone who would pay, anything to keep his mind occupied and his hands busy. The cabin felt too empty now, too quiet without Margaret's humming as she cooked or the gentle sound of her reading aloud from the Bible in the evenings. He was 32 years old and felt ancient, hollowed out, a husk of the man who had brought his bride west 5 years ago with dreams of building something lasting. The general store needed its front steps replaced, rotted through by spring rains, and Thomas had quoted a fair price to Mr. Henderson. He pulled the wagon to a stop outside the store, wiping sweat from his brow with his forearm, and began unloading the fresh-cut pine boards. The wood was heavy and solid, and he welcomed the strain in his muscles, the simple clarity of physical labor. He was measuring the second board when he heard the commotion inside the store, raised voices cutting through the afternoon stillness. Thomas straightened, frowning, recognizing Henderson's angry tone but not the woman's voice that answered, steady and calm despite the obvious tension. "I do not care what your credit policy is, Mr. Henderson. I have the money and I am purchasing these supplies. Not in my store, you are not. I know your type, coming here with your widow's weeds and your sad story, thinking folks will just hand over charity." Thomas set down his hammer and stepped through the open doorway, his eyes adjusting to the dimmer interior. A woman stood at the counter, her back ramrod straight in a dress of deep gray that had been mended carefully at the hem. Dark blonde hair was pinned up beneath a simple bonnet, and even from behind he could see the tension in her shoulders. Henderson's face was red, his jowls quivering with indignation. "Is there a problem?" Thomas asked quietly, and both of them turned to look at him. The woman's eyes were the color of creek water in spring, gray-green and clear, set in a face that was pale and drawn but still lovely, despite the obvious exhaustion etched into her features. She could not have been more than 27 or 28, but grief had left its mark on her just as surely as it had on him. He recognized it instantly, that particular hollowness around the eyes, the way she held herself as if bracing against an invisible wind. "No problem at all, Fletcher," Henderson said quickly. "Just explaining to Mrs. Vaughn here that I cannot extend credit to every person who wanders into town." "I am not asking for credit," the woman said, her voice tight with restrained anger. She placed several coins on the counter with deliberate precision. "I am attempting to purchase flour, beans, and salt. I have the exact payment." Henderson made no move to take the money. Stores closed for the day, for inventory. It was a transparent lie. Thomas had received word just that morning that Henderson wanted the steps done by week's end, because business was too good to close even for a day. He looked at the woman, at the proud set of her jaw and the basket on her arm that contained, from what he could see, only a heel of bread and a withered apple. Then he looked at Henderson, at the petty cruelty in the man's small eyes. "If the store is closed, I suppose I cannot work on the front steps," Thomas said mildly. "Safety hazard, you understand. Having customers try to navigate around my tools and lumber might take me an extra week to finish, maybe 2. Henderson's expression shifted rapidly from confusion to anger to calculation. He was silent for a long moment, then snatched up the coins from the counter with ill grace. "Fine. But I want you to know, Mrs. Vaughn, that charity has its limits in this town." "Then it is fortunate I am not requesting charity, only basic commerce," she replied coolly. She waited while Henderson gathered her purchases with rough, careless movements, shoving them into her basket without any attempt at courtesy. When he thrust the basket toward her, she took it without flinching, though Thomas saw her knuckles whiten where she gripped the handle. She turned and walked toward the door, and Thomas stepped aside to let her pass. She paused at the threshold, looking up at him with those clear eyes. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You did not have to do that." "Yes, I did," Thomas said, and was surprised to find he meant it. She studied his face for a moment, and something shifted in her expression, a recognition perhaps of shared pain. Then she nodded once and stepped out into the bright sunlight, walking with careful dignity down the boardwalk toward the east end of town, where the smaller, shabbier houses clustered. Thomas watched her go, feeling something stir in his chest that was not quite curiosity, but not quite indifference either. Then Henderson was calling him back inside, complaining about the heat and demanding to know when the steps would be finished. And Thomas pushed the woman from his mind to focus on the work at hand. But that evening, as he sat alone in his cabin eating cold beans from a tin plate, he found himself thinking about her again. Kathryn Vaughn, Henderson had called her. A widow, clearly, and newly enough that the grief was still raw. He wondered what her story was, how she had ended up in Nevada with nothing but a few coins and a basket of meager supplies. He wondered if she felt the same crushing loneliness that dogged his every step, the sense that the world had gone colorless and flat. He did not sleep well that night, but then, he rarely did any more. 3 days passed before he saw her again. He had finished Henderson's steps and moved on to repairing a collapsed section of fence for the widow Morrison, 2 miles outside of town. It was brutal work in the August heat, digging new post holes in soil that had been baked hard as stone, but he welcomed it. He was tamping down the 4th post when he saw a figure walking along the road, moving slowly in the shimmering heat. As the figure drew closer, he recognized Kathryn Vaughn's gray dress, her bonnet shading her face from the relentless sun. She was walking with visible effort, and when she stumbled slightly over a rut in the road, Thomas set down his tools and jogged over to her. "Mrs. Vaughn," he said, and she looked up at him with a startled expression, as if she had been lost in her own thoughts and had not noticed his approach. Her face was flushed and damp with perspiration. "Are you all right?" "Yes, of course," she said automatically, but her voice was hoarse and thin. "I am just walking into town. I have business with Mrs. Morrison." "Her place is right here," Thomas said, gesturing to the property behind him. "But you look about ready to collapse. When did you last drink water?" She blinked at him, confusion clouding her eyes, and he realized with a jolt that she was closer to heat exhaustion than he had initially thought. Without waiting for permission, he took her arm and guided her off the road to the shade of a large oak tree. She sank down onto the grass with a small sound of relief, and he retrieved his canteen from where it hung on the fence post. "Drink," he said, crouching beside her and pressing the canteen into her hands. Slowly. She obeyed, taking small sips, and gradually the unhealthy flush faded from her cheeks. She closed her eyes and leaned back against the tree trunk, breathing deeply. "I am sorry," she said after a moment. "That was foolish of me. I should have brought water." "It is a long walk in this heat," Thomas agreed. "Where are you staying?" "The old Brennan place at the far end of town. It was available cheaply." She opened her eyes and looked at him. "You are Mr. Fletcher, are you not? Mrs. Morrison mentioned you when I spoke with her yesterday. She said you do fine work." "Thomas," he said, "and I do decent work, nothing fancy. Thomas, she repeated, and the name sounded different in her voice, softer somehow. I am Kathryn, though I suppose you heard that already at the store. I did. He sat down in the grass beside her, suddenly reluctant to return to the fence posts. Mrs. Morrison is probably inside. She said she needed help with mending and washing. Is that your trade? It is now, Kathryn said with a trace of bitterness. Before the war, I was a school teacher in Tennessee. My husband Samuel was a lawyer. We had a good life. She was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing the rim of the canteen. He enlisted in '62 with the Union Army. He believed strongly in the cause. He died at Stones River on the last day of '62 in the first hour of the fighting. The words were delivered in a flat, controlled tone, but Thomas heard the ocean of grief beneath them. I am sorry, he said, knowing how inadequate the words were. Everyone is sorry, Kathryn said, not unkindly. But it does not bring him back, and it does not change the fact that his family blamed me for his decision to enlist, and his death left me with nothing. I sold everything we owned just to travel here, to try to start over somewhere no one knew me. No one would judge me. Why Missouri? Thomas asked. You had no family here, no connections. That was precisely why, she said. I wanted to be somewhere anonymous, somewhere I could simply exist without having to explain myself constantly or endure pitying looks from people who used to be friends. She handed the canteen back to him, their fingers brushing briefly. And you, Mrs. Morrison mentioned you had suffered a loss as well. Thomas felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the one that came whenever anyone mentioned Margaret. My wife, he said simply. Last winter. The fever came through and took her in 3 days. She was 29 years old and strong as a horse, and then she was just gone. Kathryn nodded slowly, understanding in her eyes. How long ago? February. 6 months. He looked down at his hands, calloused and scarred from work. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like a lifetime ago. Yes, Kathryn said softly. Yes, exactly that. They sat in silence for a while, and it was not uncomfortable. There was something restful about being with someone who understood, who did not need explanations or platitudes. Finally, Kathryn stood, brushing grass from her skirt, and Thomas rose as well. I should speak with Mrs. Morrison, she said. Thank you for your kindness, Thomas. It seems you make a habit of helping me. Seems so, he agreed, and was rewarded with a small, tentative smile that transformed her face, making her look younger and less burdened. He watched her walk up the path to the Morrison house, then returned to his fence posts with a strange lightness in his chest that he had not felt in months. After that, he seemed to run into Kathryn Vaughn everywhere. He saw her at the general store, purchasing supplies with careful economy, and walked her back to the Brennan place carrying her parcels. He saw her at church on Sunday, sitting alone in a back pew, and found himself choosing a seat nearby, close enough that he could hear her clear soprano voice during the hymns. He saw her in the small cafe where he sometimes took his midday meal, and invited her to join him at his table, where they talked about everything and nothing, carefully skirting the raw edges of their grief. He learned that she had been married for 5 years before Samuel's death, that they had hoped for children but none had come, that she had loved teaching and missed it fiercely. She learned that he had grown up in Indiana, that he had learned carpentry from his father, that Margaret had been a merchant's daughter who chose him over wealthier suitors because she loved his laugh. These conversations were precious to Thomas, small islands of connection in the sea of loneliness that had become his life. September arrived with cooler temperatures and the first hints of autumn color in the trees. Thomas was working on a new barn roof for a farmer named Jessup when Kathryn appeared, carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. Mrs. Jessup said I would find you here, she called up to him. I thought you might be hungry. Thomas climbed down the ladder, wiping his hands on his work trousers. You did not have to do that. I wanted to, Kathryn said. You have been kind to me, and I wish to return the favor. The basket contained fried chicken, fresh bread, and apple tart, more food than Thomas had seen in one place since Margaret's death. They sat in the shade of the barn and ate together, and Kathryn told him about the sewing work that was slowly building, how several of the town ladies had begun bringing her mending and alterations. Mrs. Morrison recommended me, she said, pleasure evident in her voice. And Mrs. Henderson, of all people, came by yesterday with 3 dresses that needed taking in. She did not apologize for her husband's behavior, of course, but I think it was her way of making amends. That is good, Thomas said. You deserve to have success here. Kathryn looked at him, her expression growing serious. Why did you help me that first day? You did not know me. You had no reason to intervene. Thomas considered the question, trying to find words for something he had not fully articulated even to himself. I saw you standing there, he said finally, and you reminded me of Margaret, not in looks but in the way you held yourself. Proud, even when things were hard. And I thought about how scared Margaret must have been when the fever came on, how alone, even though I was right there beside her. I could not help her, but I could help you, so I did. Kathryn's eyes were bright with unshed tears. That is the kindest thing anyone has said to me in a very long time. They finished the meal in companionable silence, and when Kathryn stood to leave, Thomas found himself reaching for her hand, stopping her. Would you take supper with me sometime? At my cabin. I know it is not entirely proper, but I would like to cook for you to repay your kindness. Kathryn smiled, and this time it reached her eyes, warming them. I would like that very much. The following Saturday, Thomas spent the entire day cleaning his cabin, scrubbing floors and washing windows until the place gleamed. He slaughtered one of his chickens and roasted it with potatoes and carrots from his garden, and he even picked wildflowers and arranged them in a jar on the table, feeling foolish and hopeful in equal measure. Kathryn arrived at sunset, wearing a dress of deep blue that brought out the color of her eyes. She had let her hair down from its usual severe bun, and it fell in soft waves over her shoulders. Thomas felt his breath catch at the sight of her. You look beautiful, he said, and then flushed at his own boldness, but Kathryn only smiled and stepped inside. Your home is lovely, Thomas, so tidy. I had help, he admitted. Margaret taught me. She said a man who lived alone was likely to live like an animal if left to his own devices. It was the first time he had spoken Margaret's name easily, without the crushing weight of grief, and he saw Kathryn notice it, saw understanding in her expression. They ate the roasted chicken and talked as the sky outside darkened and stars emerged. Thomas lit lamps, and the golden light softened the edges of everything, made the cabin feel warm and welcoming in a way it had not since Margaret's death. Kathryn told him about growing up in Tennessee, about her parents who had died when she was young, about the aunt who had raised her. Thomas told her about his childhood in Indiana, about learning to build and repair, about the satisfaction of working with his hands. I always thought I would have children, Kathryn said quietly, staring into her coffee cup. Samuel and I tried for so long. I wondered if there was something wrong with me, if I was being punished for some sin I did not know I had committed. And then he died, and I thought that door was closed forever. Margaret wanted children too, Thomas said. We had one, a daughter, but she only lived 3 days. Margaret nearly died as well. The doctor said she could not have more, that her body would not survive another pregnancy. He swallowed hard against the sudden tightness in his throat. She grieved that loss until the day she died. She would have been a wonderful mother. Kathryn reached across the table and took his hand, and Thomas looked down at their joined fingers, at the way her skin looked pale against his sun-darkened hand. "I am sure she was wonderful in many ways," Kathryn said. "Just as Samuel was a good man, an honorable man. But they are gone, Thomas, and we are still here. We are allowed to keep living." "Are we?" Thomas asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Some days it feels like a betrayal to laugh or feel joy or even just to not hurt as much." "I know," Kathryn whispered. "I know exactly what you mean. But I do not think they would want us to live in permanent darkness. I think they would want us to find light again, wherever we could." Thomas turned his hand over, lacing his fingers through hers, and they sat that way for a long moment, connected by shared grief and something else, something tentative and fragile but real. When Kathryn finally stood to leave, Thomas walked her back to town through the cool night air, the moon nearly full overhead. At her door, she turned to him, and without thinking, without planning, Thomas leaned down and kissed her softly on the forehead. "Thank you for coming," he said. Kathryn looked up at him, her eyes shining in the moonlight. "Thank you for inviting me." After that evening, their relationship shifted and deepened. They began spending more time together openly, and the town gossips noticed, of course, whispering behind their hands about how unseemly it was, two people widowed so recently courting in public. But Thomas found he did not care what others thought. For the first time since Margaret's death, he felt alive again, felt like he had something to look forward to beyond the next day's work. October brought a cold snap and the first frost. Thomas was repairing the schoolhouse windows when he saw Kathryn walking quickly down the street, her shawl pulled tight against the wind. He climbed down from his ladder and called to her, and she turned, her face lighting up when she saw him. "I was hoping I would find you," she said. "Mrs. Henderson just told me that the schoolteacher position is open again. Apparently, Miss Thornton is getting married and moving to Kansas City. Mrs. Henderson suggested I apply for it." "That is wonderful news," Thomas said, genuinely pleased. "You would be perfect for it." But Kathryn's expression was troubled. "I do not know if I can. Teaching again, it would mean facing all those memories of when I taught before, when Samuel was alive and we were planning our future together. I am not sure I am ready for that." Thomas set down his tools and took both her hands in his, not caring who might see. "Kathryn, you are one of the strongest people I have ever met. You traveled halfway across the country alone to start a new life. You have built a business and a reputation here in just a few months. If you want to teach again, you should. And those memories you are afraid of facing, they are part of who you are. They do not have to be painful forever." Kathryn searched his face, and then slowly she nodded. "You are right. I should at least try. And if it is too difficult, I can always go back to sewing." "That is the spirit," Thomas said, and was rewarded with one of her rare, brilliant smiles. She got the position, starting the following week, and Thomas watched with quiet pride as she threw herself into the work with the same determination she brought to everything else. She told him about her students, about the challenges of teaching children of all ages in one room, about the satisfaction of watching understanding dawn in a child's eyes. Teaching gave her purpose and confidence, and Thomas saw her grief gradually transform from a crushing burden into something more bearable, woven into the fabric of who she was rather than defining her entirely. In November, Thomas began working on a new project, something he had not told Kathryn about. He was building a hope chest, using the finest oak he could find, carving delicate patterns into the lid during his evening hours by lamplight. He was not entirely sure what he intended to do with it, but he needed to create something beautiful, something that represented possibility rather than loss. The first snowfall came in early December, light flakes that melted as soon as they touched the ground. Thomas and Kathryn were walking back from church when she slipped on a patch of ice, and he caught her, his arms going around her waist to steady her. She looked up at him, and suddenly they were very close, her breath misting in the cold air between them. "Thomas," she said softly, and he could hear a question in her voice, an invitation. He kissed her then, truly kissed her for the first time, and it was nothing like kissing Margaret had been. This was different, new, its own thing entirely. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard, and Kathryn's cheeks were flushed with more than just cold. "I have been wanting to do that for weeks," Thomas admitted. "I have been wanting you to do that for weeks," Kathryn replied, and then laughed, a sound of pure joy that made Thomas's heart feel too large for his chest. That evening, sitting before her small fireplace, Kathryn took his hand and said, "I need to tell you something. I am afraid of what is happening between us. Not because I do not care for you, because I do, more than I thought possible, but because I am terrified of losing someone again. I do not know if I could survive that pain a second time." Thomas understood completely because he felt the same fear, the same vulnerability. "I cannot promise that nothing will ever happen," he said carefully. "Life is uncertain, and loss is always possible. But I can promise that I will do everything in my power to be here, to build a life with you, to make whatever time we have together worthwhile." "That is all any of us can promise," Kathryn said, and leaned her head against his shoulder. Winter deepened, but it did not have the same horror for Thomas that the previous winter had held. He was not facing the cold and darkness alone. He and Kathryn spent Christmas together, exchanging modest gifts, Thomas giving her the hope chest he had built, Kathryn giving him a quilt she had sewn from scraps of fabric, each piece carefully chosen and stitched. The quilt was beautiful, a riot of colors and patterns, and Thomas understood that it represented all the broken pieces of their lives being transformed into something whole and new. "Will you marry me?" Thomas asked on New Year's Eve, as they stood outside her house watching the neighbors set off fireworks to celebrate the arrival of 1868. "I know it has not been quite a year for either of us, and people will talk, but I do not want to wait any more. I want to wake up beside you every morning. I want to build a life with you." Kathryn turned to him, tears streaming down her face in the flickering light of the fireworks. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Thomas, I will marry you." They were wed in February, a small ceremony attended by the friends they had made in Nevada. Mrs. Morrison cried, and even Henderson looked grudgingly approving. Kathryn wore a dress of cream-colored silk that she had sewn herself, and Thomas wore his best suit, brushed and pressed until it looked nearly new. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas kissed Kathryn with all the hope and love he had thought he would never feel again. They moved into Thomas's cabin together, and Kathryn brought her few possessions, arranging them beside his own. It felt right, having her things mixed with his, creating a new home that belonged to both of them. She hung curtains in the windows and planted flowers in the yard when spring came, and slowly the cabin stopped being the place where Thomas had lost Margaret and became the place where he and Kathryn were building their future. The first year of their marriage was not without challenges. They both still had moments when grief would ambush them, when a particular song or smell or turn of phrase would bring back memories of their first spouses with painful clarity. But they learned to weather these storms together, to comfort each other without trying to fix what could not be fixed, to simply be present and understanding. Kathryn continued teaching, and Thomas continued his carpentry work, and they built a reputation as a solid, respectable couple. In the evenings, they would sit together on the porch, Thomas whittling and Kathryn mending, talking about their days and making plans for the future. In the summer of 1869, Kathryn came to Thomas with news that made her eyes shine with a mixture of joy and fear. "I am with child," she said. "I know the doctor said I might never conceive, that I was too old, but it has happened. I am pregnant, Thomas." Thomas felt a wave of emotions crash over him, elation and terror in equal measure. He thought of Margaret, of the daughter they had lost, of how close he had come to losing Margaret as well during that terrible time. But he looked at Kathryn, at her hopeful, frightened face, and he pushed those fears down. "That is wonderful," he said, pulling her into his arms. "That is the best news I could possibly hear." "I am scared," Kathryn admitted against his chest. "I am 30 years old and I have never carried a child to term. What if something goes wrong?" "Then we will face it together," Thomas said firmly. "But we are not going to borrow trouble. We are going to hope for the best and prepare for whatever comes." They found a good doctor in Nevada, a man named Dr. Phillips who had studied back east and had experience with difficult pregnancies. He examined Kathryn thoroughly and pronounced her healthy, with a good chance of delivering safely. "You are strong," he told her, "and you are not as old as you think. Women have babies well into their 30s. Just take care of yourself, eat well, and rest when you need to." Kathryn followed his advice religiously, and Thomas watched over her like a hawk, making sure she did not overexert herself, that she ate properly, that she got enough sleep. The school board was understanding, finding a temporary replacement when Kathryn's condition made it difficult to stand for long hours. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer and fall. Kathryn bloomed with it, her skin glowing, her eyes bright with anticipation. Thomas found himself falling in love with her all over again, watching her sing to their unborn child, watching her knit tiny clothes and blankets with meticulous care. In January of 1870, on a cold but clear night, Kathryn went into labor. Thomas fetched Dr. Phillips and then paced the floor of their cabin while the doctor and Mrs. Morrison, who had come to help, attended to Kathryn. He could hear her crying out in pain, and every sound was a knife to his heart. He thought of Margaret, of how she had labored for 18 hours before their daughter was born, already blue and still. And he had to grip the edge of the table to keep from charging into the bedroom, but this time was different. After 6 hours that felt like 6 years, he heard a new sound, a lusty, angry cry that was the most beautiful thing he had ever heard. Dr. Phillips emerged from the bedroom, his sleeves rolled up and his face tired but smiling. "Congratulations, Thomas. You have a healthy son. And your wife did beautifully. She is tired but well." Thomas nearly collapsed with relief. A son. He had a son, and Kathryn was alive and well. He stumbled into the bedroom where Mrs. Morrison was cleaning up, and Kathryn was propped up on pillows, holding a tiny, red-faced bundle wrapped in one of the blankets she had made. "Thomas," she said, her voice hoarse but radiant, "come meet your son." Thomas sat carefully on the edge of the bed and looked down at the baby. He was so small, so fragile, with a cap of dark hair and eyes that were just beginning to open. "He is perfect," Thomas whispered. "You did so well, Kathryn. I am so proud of you." "We did well," Kathryn corrected and placed the baby in Thomas's arms. Thomas held his son and felt something inside him shift and heal. This child represented so much, a future he had not dared to hope for, a family reborn from the ashes of loss. They named him Samuel Thomas Fletcher, honoring both of the people they had loved and lost, and also looking forward to who this new little person would become. The next few months were exhausting and wonderful. Samuel was a good baby, healthy and strong, and he thrived under his parents' devoted attention. Thomas built a cradle for him, carving it with the same care he had used on Kathryn's hope chest, and Kathryn sang to him every night, the same lullabies she had learned from her own mother. Watching Kathryn with their son, Thomas felt his heart expand with a love he had not known was possible. She was a natural mother, patient and nurturing, and she glowed with happiness in a way that made her more beautiful than ever. And seeing Thomas with Samuel, so gentle and protective, Kathryn fell even more deeply in love with her husband, grateful every day for the chance they had found together. As Samuel grew, Thomas and Kathryn's lives settled into a comfortable rhythm. Thomas's carpentry business prospered, and he took on an apprentice, a young man named Jacob who showed real talent. Kathryn returned to teaching part-time when Samuel was old enough, bringing him to the schoolhouse where he played in the corner while she taught her lessons. The students adored him, and Samuel grew up surrounded by books and learning, curious and bright. In the spring of 1872, Kathryn discovered she was pregnant again. This time there was less fear and more anticipation. Their daughter, Margaret Kathryn Fletcher, was born in November of that year, a tiny, delicate thing with her mother's gray-green eyes and her father's dark hair. Samuel, now nearly 3 years old, was fascinated by his baby sister, insisting on helping with everything from feeding to changing to rocking her cradle. Thomas and Kathryn named their daughter after both of the people they had lost, wanting to honor Margaret's memory while also celebrating the new life they had created. It felt right, a way of acknowledging the past while firmly embracing the future. The years that followed were busy and rich. Thomas expanded his carpentry work, eventually opening a small shop in town where he sold furniture and took custom orders. Kathryn taught for many years, becoming one of the most respected educators in the county, known for her patience and her ability to inspire even the most reluctant students. Samuel grew into a thoughtful, intelligent boy who loved books and building things with his father. Margaret was spirited and imaginative, with a gift for drawing and storytelling. On quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the house was peaceful, Thomas and Kathryn would sit together on their porch, holding hands and watching the stars. They talked about everything and nothing, sometimes sharing memories of Samuel and Margaret, the first Margaret, the spouses they had lost. But these memories no longer carried the same crushing weight. They had been transformed by time and love into something softer, more bittersweet than purely painful. "You think they would approve?" Kathryn asked one night when Samuel was 10 and Margaret was 8. "Of us, of the life we have built?" Thomas considered the question seriously. "I think Margaret would be happy that I found love again, that I am not alone. She never wanted me to be alone. And I think your Samuel would be proud of the woman you have become, the mother you are, the strength you have shown." "I think you are right," Kathryn said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I think they would be glad we found each other, that we found peace together. Peace. It was the right word for what they had built. Not the absence of pain or struggle, because life always held those elements, but a deep, abiding sense of rightness, of being exactly where they were meant to be. They had both known profound loss, had both been shaped by grief, but they had not let that grief define them. Instead, they had chosen to keep living, to keep loving, to keep hoping. In 1875, Thomas's father died back in Indiana, and Thomas traveled back for the funeral, bringing his whole family with him. It was Kathryn's first time meeting Thomas's extended family, and she was nervous, but she need not have been. Thomas's sisters welcomed her warmly, exclaiming over the children and treating Kathryn like she had always been part of the family. They visited Margaret's grave, and Thomas introduced Kathryn to his first wife, kneeling beside the headstone with his hand on the carved letters of her name. "I brought my family to meet you," he said softly. "My wife Kathryn and our children Samuel and Margaret. I hope you do not mind that we named our daughter after you. It seemed right to honor your memory that way." Kathryn knelt beside him and placed a small bouquet of wildflowers on the grave. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for loving him, for making him the man he is. I promise to take care of him, to love him well." It was an odd moment, poignant and strange, but also healing. Thomas felt a sense of closure he had not realized he needed, a feeling that he had permission, however irrational that thought might be, to fully embrace his new life without guilt. They returned to Nevada with lighter hearts, and life continued its steady, satisfying progression. Samuel showed an aptitude for carpentry and began working with his father in the shop as soon as he was old enough. Margaret pursued her artistic talents, eventually selling her drawings and paintings to people throughout the county. Both children grew up knowing the stories of their namesakes, understanding that they were part of a larger tapestry of love and loss and resilience. In 1880, on their 12th wedding anniversary, Thomas gave Kathryn a locket containing 2 tiny photographs, one of Samuel in his Union uniform and one of Margaret in her wedding dress. "So you can keep them close," he explained. "They were part of your life, part of what made you who you are. They deserve to be remembered." Kathryn wept as she fastened the locket around her neck. "I love you," she said. "I love you so much, Thomas Fletcher. Thank you for understanding, for never making me choose between my past and my present." "There is no choice to make," Thomas said, kissing her softly. "You can honor what was while living fully in what is. That is what we have always done." The years continued to pass, bringing changes both welcome and challenging. Samuel married a local girl named Emma in 1887, and they gave Thomas and Kathryn their first grandchild, a boy they named Thomas Samuel, in 1888. Margaret married a teacher from Kansas City in 1890, and they settled there, visiting Nevada regularly with their growing family. Thomas and Kathryn grew older together, their hair turning gray, their faces lining with the marks of years well lived. Thomas's hands grew arthritic, making it difficult to do the fine detail work he had once excelled at. But Samuel took over more and more of the business, keeping the Fletcher name respected in the community. Kathryn retired from teaching in 1892, after nearly 25 years in the classroom, and the town threw her a celebration, with former students traveling from all over to honor her. They spent their later years in quiet contentment, surrounded by children and grandchildren, secure in the knowledge that they had built something lasting. On warm evenings, they still sat on their porch, holding hands and watching the sun set over the Missouri hills, talking about the past and the future in equal measure. "We have had a good life," Kathryn said one evening in the summer of 1898, when they were both in their 60s and the 20th century was looming on the horizon. "Better than I ever thought possible when I first arrived here, so lost and alone." "We have had a wonderful life," Thomas agreed, "and it is not over yet. We still have years ahead of us, God willing." And they did. They lived to see the new century arrive, to watch their grandchildren grow and their family expand. They celebrated 50 years of marriage in 1918, surrounded by 4 children, 12 grandchildren, and 3 great-grandchildren, all of them descendants of 2 people who had found each other in the depths of grief and chosen to build something beautiful together. Late in their lives, sitting together in the cabin they had shared for so many decades, Kathryn asked Thomas if he ever regretted anything about their life together. He thought about it carefully before answering, wanting to be honest. "I regret that Margaret died so young," he said finally. I regret that your Samuel never got to see you become the woman you are, never got to meet our children. But I do not regret us, Kathryn. I do not regret a single moment we have had together. We found peace in each other when we both desperately needed it, and we built a life that honored our losses while celebrating our love. That is nothing to regret. Kathryn smiled, her eyes still that beautiful gray-green despite the years. I feel the same way. We were both broken when we met, but we helped heal each other. And I think, in the end, that is what love is supposed to do. Not erase the pain, but make it bearable. Not replace what was lost, but create something new and equally precious. Thomas kissed her forehead, his lips lingering on her soft skin. You have always been wiser than me. Not wiser, Kathryn said, just more willing to put my thoughts into words. They lived well into their 70s, finally passing within months of each other in 1921, their long lives full of love and purpose. They were buried together in the cemetery behind the church in Nevada, under a simple headstone that bore both their names and a single inscription. They found peace together. Their children and grandchildren gathered for the funeral, sharing stories about Thomas's kindness and skill, about Kathryn's intelligence and compassion, about the way they had loved each other with a depth that came from understanding true loss and choosing love anyway. And as the family stood around the grave, Samuel the younger, now a grandfather himself, told his own children about how their great-grandparents had met, two wounded people who found healing in each other's company. They taught us that grief is not the end, he said. That even after the worst losses, life can still be beautiful and full of joy. They taught us that love is not a finite resource, that you can honor the past while building a future. They were remarkable people, and we are all better for having known them. And in that moment, standing in the Missouri sunshine with his family around him, Samuel understood with perfect clarity what his great-grandparents had known all along. That the human heart has an infinite capacity for love, that loss and joy can coexist, and that sometimes the most profound peace comes from finding someone who understands your pain and chooses to walk beside you anyway, building something new from the broken pieces of what came before. Thomas Fletcher and Kathryn Vaughn had each lost their first loves to circumstances beyond their control, but they had not let that loss define them. Instead, they had found each other, and in doing so, they had found peace, purpose, and a love that lasted until the end of their days.